Hi guys, I'm going to be doing something a bit different with this Sunday's excerpt. As you might know from my video at the beginning of the week, this week's book started out as a book draft when I was a teenager, which I never finished. And then I used parts of that book idea draft to write a short story called The Soldier's Choice. Now, this week I started over from scratch to write the idea into a book again. So what I'm going to do is show how I'm competing against myself. One me is from 10 years ago, the short story, and the other me is from roughly 30 years ago, the original book draft. I'll be reading an excerpt from each one and let you decide which one do you prefer. Okay, I'm going to start with teenager me and my teenager writing. Here's the first page or so of my original book draft. Despite the desert heat of the valley, the air was cool and moist by the time I reached the top of the hill. The stiff-bladed grass that flourished only in my mountain homeland spread down the hilltop like water running from a spring. The source of the verdant spring was in front of me, a deeply glowing cherrywood cross. Rubies were splattered across its surface like the random flow of blood from a deep wound. The cross was off-center and askew upon the pitted limestone surface of a stone table. If the relic had been placed on the table in a formal stand, I would have called the table an altar. Ancient and plainly carved like the ruins of the Oasis people, ivy and moss wound about its feet like a courtesan's bronze anklets. My legs were like the stone table before me, heavy, hard to move. I felt no emotion, only a sense of weariness. What had I accomplished by coming here? Before me was the cross. Below and behind me was the vegetation of home, a cool green smell that was a joyful song to my senses. I had traveled across 5 countries to reach this spot, and all I could think of was the effort it had taken to reach this point. Where were my companions, my family, or even the homeland that the fresh smell of spring brought to mind? The foliage surrounding me must be an illusion, a spell, an Oasian mockery in the midst of the desert. It felt as real as my victory. I felt like a gourd that had been poured out, the rind of a sweetly devoured fruit, a rotting skin carelessly tossed aside once the butchering is finished. I'd accomplished what I set out to do, and the accomplishment was empty. I watched my hand reach towards the cross without any sense of willpower to make it move. It was the thing I had come for, a thing that I had exchanged for everything that made me an Eltrand warrior. For what did it mean that I had the cross if I had no kin and country? So, not a bad start to a book, and especially not bad for a 16-year-old writer. Now, here's the start of the short story that I wrote about 10 years ago. If there was one man whom Shazia could call a friend, it was Ibn. Most people thought that he should have followed in his father's footsteps and become a warrior rather than whatever he was. When she had first come to Castle Var, she thought the same thing when she had heard rumors about Rabinar's useless second son. A layabout, the maid had told her, buckling together the sides of Shazia's leather armor before the banquet dinner. Shazia had dressed herself since she was old enough to walk, but she wasn't about to argue with a woman who could have hidden a small pony under her skirts. Just be sure to talk to Pelagor seated on your left. He's a decent sort of man with a son who's just beginning his training. The woman eyed her charge critically. You're pretty big for your age, aren't you? Suck in a bit. I need to tighten these straps. The chair on her right was empty when she was escorted to her seat moments later, trying to remember how to breathe in armor that, with the maid's help, was as restrictive as a corset. It wasn't until the first and second course had been served and taken away that the tramp of heavy boots interrupted the quiet conversation flowing through the hall. Sorry, sorry, a voice announced loudly behind her as the man reached the vacant chair. My valet must have gotten the time wrong. Again. Up and down the table, small chuckles escaped as, with a flourish, the man pulled back the seat and settled himself comfortably, before clapping his hands in a foppish manner. Servants rushed up with the third course before Ibn could cause another disturbance. Without looking around at his other dining companions, the young man turned to face her. They must have warned you about me, I expect, he said. I am a poet, a dreamer, and a mischief maker. No more. No matter what has been said. How may I entertain my lady? It was the first time she had laughed in a month, ever since she had first learned she was to begin her training at Castle Var. From that moment on, the unlikely couple had been friends. Ibn justified it as, "I've been forced to keep you company because it keeps me out of trouble." Often, the opposite was true. He seemed to help get her into trouble, or at the very least to get her into awkward situations which could have turned into trouble if he hadn't also had a flair for diffusing those same situations. As her training progressed, she would either turn to him in frustration for his lackadaisical attitude, didn't he take anything seriously? Or in envy. He lived the lifestyle she had turned her back on, and she sometimes wished for a life of luxury, especially when she was covered in fresh bruises after learning a new maneuver on the field. And that's a different start to the same story, which focuses on the friendship of the two characters as opposed to sort of the dramatic ending type of scene. And now here's the third version, the one I've been working on this week. She had heard, of course. No one in the capital city of Eltrand could have escaped the news except, perhaps, for the perpetually drunk and those locked up in the king's dungeons. And even they might have learned about what had happened through the whispered conversations of their guards or the murmured gossip of barkeeps. Even children had been especially somber for the past handful of days, since the adults were grim with the news. There was little joy to be found in either the highest or basest of circles. As work carried on, as it must, a cloud hovered over everyday happenings. Patrols through the city streets were sometimes met with derision and jeers. The threat of imminent doom was enough for some citizens to grow bold, fearless. After all, if there was no future for the kingdom of Eltrand, what did they have to lose? When Shazia was summoned to the temple, she was sure it was a mistake. But no, there were the temple's guards, dressed in red and gold like the plumage of fancy birds. Honestly, they strutted nearly as much as the creatures they resembled, even if their words were polite to her face. "We are to escort you, milady." She didn't bother correcting them on the honorific. She was a lady, but she'd long ago given up any claim to her inherited nobility. She served the crown now, as did all officers in the army, and so her only title should be her military rank. But they had not come from the king. They were from Urdun, patron god of warriors, and the priests obeyed no master but the god. When she arrived at the temple, she didn't expect to be led straight to the altar, nor did she expect the figure waiting for her there, the high priest Vate Brig. His back was toward the golden double doors, and he must surely have heard them open and shut, and the firm sound of her boots striding fearlessly across the mosaic floor. But he did not turn around until their footsteps stopped, and even then his movements were lethargic, wary, as if he carried a great burden that was his and his alone. She supposed he did, but that did not negate the burden their entire kingdom fell under right now, the thievery of the holy star of the god. There were no introductions, no formality of allegiance offered or given. Vate Brig met her eyes and simply said, "You are charged with a task I can only entrust to one with the skills and the belief to succeed." He took a deep breath and slowly let it out, his blue gaze piercing. "You will recover the holy star of Verdun." "I?" Her surprised reaction escaped her lips before she could help it. The two of them had never spoken before, although she had, of course, seen him at holy services. This was an odd introduction. Why me? Instead of answering her question, he merely shook his head. "I have prayed," he said, "and the god has told me you are his champion." She wanted to ask why again. Why a newly arrived country bumpkin whose only kin were minor nobles and lower officers? Why one of the few women who achieved any sort of rank in the armies of the king? But Vate Brig seemed assured of her agreement, because he turned his back once more to gaze upward at the empty reliquary. She supposed it was a motivating sight to him. It certainly was to her. "If you do not do this," he said quietly, "our homeland will fall." As you can see, 3 very different ways to tackle this story, even though the bones of the story itself are the same. Just goes to show you how writers change over time. So please let me know, which one do you like best? Let me know in the comments, and don't worry about what you want to say. You can't offend me. I wrote all 3 versions. See you again tomorrow for a taste of what's to come in week 22 of Author versus AI. Until then, have a great Sunday.